Nikolaus was 28 when he went into prison and almost 34 when he came out. That was the part people always paused at if he ever told the story properly. Not the fraud. Not the sentence. The time. Because 7.5 years sounds like a number when you read it on paper. It only turns into something heavier when you start counting what it can hold. Birthdays missed. Funerals missed. Technology changing. Friends settling down. Your mother's face getting older in visiting room light. Your younger brother becoming a man while you are still being counted in and out by someone with a key ring. By the time Nikolaus came home early on good behavior, most people his age had built a first proper version of adulthood. He was carrying his in a hold-all. He had not gone to prison for violence. He had never been that kind of man and, if he was being honest, that fact mattered too much to him for too many years. He had used it to excuse himself. To separate himself from real criminals. To feel clever and unlucky instead of guilty. He went in for fraud. Organized, sustained, well-paid fraud. The sort that looks tidy from the inside right up until the court reads it back to you in plain English and strips all the little respectable words off it. When he was younger, he would have told you it was more complicated than that. At 31, he would tell you it was simple enough in the places that mattered. He wanted money badly, liked what money did to how people treated him, and spent too long around men who turned criminal thinking into normal conversation. That was how it began. Not with some huge wicked leap. Not with one dramatic moment in a dark room. With little permissions. Nikolaus grew up with his mother and younger brother in a 1.5-bedroom flat over a laundrette. If the dryers downstairs ran late, the floor in his room stayed warm long after midnight, and the whole place smelled faintly of detergent and damp plaster no matter what they did. His mother worked every shift anyone would give her. Care home nights, school cleaning, reception cover at a dentist, bits of everything. She was never still, and still somehow the money was always just enough to keep disaster at the door rather than drive it away. That kind of childhood gives some people patience. It gave Nikolaus appetite. He got tired early of looking at things through shop windows. Tired of adults saying, maybe next month. Tired of hearing that honest work built character while seeing that honest work also built bad backs, short tempers, and rent arrears. He was bright. Too bright, in some ways. Good at maths, good with systems, good at understanding where rules were weaker than they looked. Teachers liked him in that specific way teachers like boys who are clearly intelligent but slightly slippery. One of them, Mr. Talbot, once told him after class, "You have the kind of brain that will either do very well or cause a lot of damage." Nikolaus laughed because he was 17 and thought adults only said things like that to hear themselves speak. Later he would remember it exactly. At 19 he had enough qualifications to do something honest and ordinary. Administration, accounts junior work, call center management if he stuck at it. He tried some of that. Bits of that. It bored him, more than bored him really. It offended him. Not because there was anything wrong with ordinary work, but because he felt entitled to faster movement than ordinary work offered. That was the dangerous thought. Not, I deserve money. He could have survived that. I deserve it faster. At 21 he met Ferris through a friend of a friend. Ferris was older, careful, well-dressed without overdoing it, and carried himself like a man who had not only figured things out but found everyone else a little slow for not catching up. Men like that are dangerous because they don't look desperate. They look settled. They make shortcuts seem like strategy. The first things Nikolaus did were small. Helping with paperwork. Setting up accounts. Moving information from one place to another. Cleaning up details on forms so they matched what they needed to match. Nothing physical. Nothing loud. Nothing that looked like street crime to the boy he had been taught to fear becoming. He told himself exactly what men like him always tell themselves: institutions lose more money through incompetence every day, everyone at the top is taking from someone, the rich are not clean either. If the system is bent already, then working a bend into it is not the same as robbing a person face to face. Some of that was even true. That was what made it useful. The money was the final argument. When the first proper amount landed, it felt less like corruption and more like correction. He paid off his mother's arrears on the electricity without telling her where it came from. Bought his brother decent football boots. Replaced the broken fridge. Started wearing better coats. Sat in restaurants he once walked past and got used to not checking the right side of the menu first. Money doesn't just buy comfort when you've grown up without it. It buys a temporary version of self-respect. Or something that feels close enough to fool you. By 24, he wasn't too deep to pretend otherwise. Applications, fake identities, manipulated claims, layered transfers, business fronts clean enough to survive a casual check. No guns, no fights, no doorstep threats. He stayed away from that side of life on purpose, and for a long time he believed that meant something noble about him. What it really meant was that he liked his crime sanitized. Still, he was not a monster. That mattered too, though not in the way he once thought. He never enjoyed hurting people. He never enjoyed fear. If he'd been born 5 streets over into a calmer life with more money and 1 or 2 different friends, maybe he never goes near any of it. But he wasn't born there. And he did go near it. 4 years. The arrest came at 28, on a Tuesday morning that looked offensively normal outside. There had been signs before that: a phone switched off too long, one of Ferris's boys suddenly impossible to reach, rumors that someone had talked. But men inside those worlds often become addicted to normality. They wake, brush their teeth, answer a text, and decide that because disaster has not arrived by 8:15 it probably won't. It arrived at 8:23. 2 officers at the door. Then 4. His mother in the hallway with one hand over her mouth. His brother swearing from the kitchen. The flat suddenly too small for dignity. He remembered the sound of cupboard doors being opened more than anything else. Not because they were hiding money in cereal boxes like television idiots. They weren't. It was just the violation of ordinary things. Plates, socks, letters, old birthday cards, all touched and shifted and seen. Ferris had protected himself better, as men like him usually do. Nikolaus had not. Not enough. He went down for fraud and conspiracy connected to a long chain of false claims, false applications, and financial deception that reached further than he had ever let himself think about properly. The sentence was 7.5 years. He got early release on good behavior, but not enough to stop prison from taking most of his late 20s and the start of his 30s. The first year inside was not transformative. It was humiliating. People outside prison sometimes talk as if the shock of it automatically teaches character. Usually it teaches routine first, then boredom, then whatever kind of person you already were with fewer distractions available. Nikolaus was angry in the beginning. Not innocent men, angry. He wasn't stupid enough for that. Angry at himself, at Ferris, at the men who had spoken too freely, at the whole stupid chain of events that had led him from wanting money to being told when he could shower. He adapted because most men do. Kept his head down. Stayed polite. Didn't involve himself in violence. Didn't owe money. Didn't let boredom make choices for him. He was useful, and usefulness can save you from a lot in prison. He understood forms, numbers, systems. He helped other men write letters, understand paperwork, deal with fines, child support, appeals, housing issues. It gave him a place. Not safety exactly, but a lane. By his second year, the anger had worn down into something heavier. Shame, mostly. Not clean shame either. He regretted what he had done, but not in the simple public way people like. If someone wanted him to say there was no logic in it, that it had come from pure wickedness or greed untouched by circumstance, he couldn't do it. There had been logic. Ugly logic, but real. Poverty. Pride. Hunger. Wanting out. Wanting more. Getting used to money too quickly. Believing the only immoral thing was being the one who got caught. He knew now that none of that justified the fraud. But it did explain it, and he refused to lie about that just to sound redeemed. One prison officer, a stocky woman named Bernice who had seen enough men fake self-awareness to become allergic to it, told him once, "You keep talking like understanding yourself is the same as forgiving yourself." He looked up from the form he was filling in. Is it not? No. It's just the start of being less dangerous. That annoyed him for about a week, which told him she was right. Prison made him older in certain ways. Not wiser straight away. Just less romantic about his own motives. He stopped thinking of himself as an intelligent man who had made one terrible detour. He had built the detour. Brick by brick. Choice by choice. That was harder to live with, but more useful. Around his third year, he started doing courses seriously. At first it was partly to fill time. Then partly because he realized time would fill him if he didn't fill it first. Bookkeeping. Business admin, basic compliance. Data protection. Spreadsheet work. Later, fraud prevention modules, which felt so on the nose at first that he nearly laughed. But there was something honest in it. He understood exactly how financial wrongdoing worked because he had helped commit it. If there was any decent use for the mind he'd once wasted, perhaps it was learning how to stand on the other side of the same systems. A resettlement worker named June pushed him harder than he liked. "You're not stupid," she said during one meeting. "I know that. That's not praise." He frowned. "It means if you come out and drift, you'll be doing it knowingly." That stayed with him because it was impossible to wriggle around. By the time he got early release on good behavior, he was changed, not cured, not saintly, but changed in ways that mattered. Less vain. Less impressed by easy money. Less convinced the world owed him speed. He did not come out thinking prison had been secretly good for him. He was not one of those men. Prison had cost too much for that lie. But he came out determined not to turn those lost years into a second waste. Coming home was ugly in the quiet way adulthood often is. He had nowhere to go except his mother's house. By then she had moved into a smaller place, cleaner and brighter than the old flat but somehow sadder for how carefully everything had to fit. His brother had moved out 2 years earlier. The box room now held folded laundry, a broken exercise bike, and became Nikolaus's room with the addition of a narrow bed and the understanding that this was temporary. His mother was glad to have him back and angry to have needed to want that. Love and disappointment sat in the same room with them for weeks. She did not lecture much. That was worse, in its own way. Lectures you can push against. Quietness just leaves you with yourself. The job search nearly broke his nerve. He had imagined it would be bad. He had not imagined how repetitive the humiliation would be. Applications ignored. Applications rejected. Interviews that went well until the disclosure stage. Polite faces changing shape by a degree so small you might have missed it if you'd never had to study people's reactions for survival. He told himself not to take it personally, then took it personally every time. For a while, he did day labor and cash-in-hand warehouse shifts through a charity program that worked with ex-offenders. Lifting boxes, packing orders, stacking pallets, all the practical, underpaid work that keeps half the country moving while nobody thinks about who is doing it. Then he landed a more regular job. Not glamorous. Not impressive. Not even close to what he'd once imagined for himself. A packaging distribution warehouse on an industrial estate outside Birmingham. Early starts. Steel-capped boots. A supervisor who swore like punctuation. Pay barely above enough, but regular and legal. It did the job. For the first year, that mattered more than title. His supervisor, Len, looked as if life had once tried to sand him down and failed out of boredom. Thick hands, weathered face, manner halfway between blunt and kind depending on whether you'd earned the second one. Len knew about Nikolaus's record from the start and treated it the way sensible people treat a scar. Not nothing. Not everything. "You're here to work," he said on Nikolaus's first morning, handing him a fluorescent vest. "Not to impress me with remorse. Just don't make my life difficult." Nikolaus almost smiled. "I'll do my best." "Good. Because my best years are behind me and I don't need your nonsense." That was more reassuring than sympathy would have been. At the warehouse he met Joel, who was 30, broad-shouldered, funny, and had done a short sentence at 19 for drug possession. He now spoke about with the same level of embarrassment most people reserved for bad haircuts. Joel had no patience for dramatic self-pity. "If you're going to keep saying yes sir and sorry sir every time someone asks you to move a pallet," he said over lunch one day, "at least wait till they've bought you dinner." Nikolaus laughed for the first time in weeks. Joel ended up being one of the first real friends he made after prison. Not because they became instant brothers. Because Joel treated him like a man with a future rather than a cautionary tale with steel-toe boots. There were others too. Marta in Dispatch, who had raised 3 children on very little sleep and saw through self-deception faster than most judges. A course tutor named Stephen, through the local adult learning center, who told him his written work was far too tidy for a man pretending not to care. An older neighbor, Mr. Pritchard, who lent him tools and talked to him about boilers, buses, and grief as if all 3 required equal seriousness. That was the part nobody tells you about starting again. Improvement is often social before it looks financial. You need a few decent people around you who make nonsense harder to maintain. Nikolaus kept doing free courses in the evenings. Properly this time, not in the half-hearted way he'd once approached anything that didn't pay him immediately. Excel. Data handling. Compliance basics. Anti-money laundering awareness. Risk administration. Customer service modules. Anything that might nudge a future employer into seeing him as something other than convicted fraudster with warehouse boots. Some nights he hated it. He'd come home tired, shoulders aching, hands dry from cardboard dust, eat whatever his mother had left covered on the hob, and stare at the laptop wanting to throw it. Because learning felt slow. Because change felt slow. Because part of him still resented how hard he now had to work for the sort of ordinary life other men had managed by simply not going to prison in the first place. He relapsed once, though not into crime. Into self-pity. For about a month, he stopped trying properly. Went to work, came home, did nothing useful, scrolled his phone, slept badly, snapped at his mother, ignored Joel's messages, told himself the system had made his future too narrow to bother pushing much harder. It was Joel who pulled him up on it. They were sitting on milk crates behind the warehouse after a shift, eating crisps and waiting for rain to pass. "You've gone weird lately," Joel said. Nikolaus shrugged. "Just tired." "No." "Sulky." Nikolaus looked over. "That's a childish word. You're behaving childishly." He said nothing. Joel wiped his hands on his trousers. "Listen. You can be unlucky and accountable at the same time. You've got this thing where if life doesn't reward your effort fast enough, you start acting like effort itself was the scam." That landed harder than Nikolaus wanted. Because it was true. Because it was old. Because it sounded too much like the younger man who wanted money faster than life was built to give it. He went home that night and signed up for another course. Not out of inspiration. Out of stubbornness. Sometimes that's the more useful fuel. The better job came through a course contact. Not some miraculous offer. Just an email from Stephen, the adult learning tutor, saying a small financial compliance support firm in the city was hiring entry-level analysts and might be willing to consider non-standard backgrounds if the candidate actually knew what non-standard meant. Nikolaus nearly didn't apply. The words financial compliance and convicted of fraud in the same room felt like a bad joke. Then he thought, who better to understand risk than someone who had once helped build it? The interview was difficult and, to his surprise, honest. The hiring manager, a woman named Helen who wore practical shoes and had clearly aged out of being impressed by polished nonsense, asked him directly, "Why should I trust you in this kind of environment?" He could have rehearsed something. Plenty of men did. Instead he said, "You shouldn't trust me quickly. But you can test me properly." She sat back. "Go on." "I know how fraud looks from the inside," he said. "I know how people justify it to themselves, how they smooth language around it, how they exploit tired systems and tired staff. I also know what it costs. Not just the prison. The years after. The way one set of choices keeps charging interest. I'm not asking you to ignore the conviction. I'm saying it's part of why I'd be useful, if I earn the chance." The room stayed quiet for a second. Then Helen nodded once, as if he had finally started speaking like a grown man. He got the job. It wasn't glamorous either. Junior compliance support analyst at a small but respectable firm that handled fraud checks and risk admin for smaller lenders and business clients. The salary was not extraordinary, but compared to the warehouse it felt like a shift in climate. He still lived with his mother for the first several months, partly to save, partly because deposits and references are harder after prison even when nobody says that directly. But by 31, after 2 hard years of ordinary work, courses, train commutes, packed lunches, and keeping his head down in the useful way rather than the criminal one, he moved into a small one-bedroom flat of his own. It wasn't fancy. Cream walls. Thin carpet. A kitchen so narrow he had to stand sideways to open the oven fully. One good window in the living room that caught late afternoon light. But it was his. No one in the building knew he'd been to prison. No one at the corner shop looked twice at him. At work he was just Nikolaus from compliance, the one who drank too much coffee and knew odd details about fraudulent claims behavior. That